If you clicked on this video, you're about to discover why certain quantum experiments are never mentioned in mainstream science education, never discussed in popular physics, never shared in spiritual teachings that claim to be based on quantum mechanics. Not because these experiments failed, not because they were disproven, but because they succeeded too well. Because they demonstrated something so profound, so destabilizing to consensus reality, so threatening to established worldviews that they were quietly buried, removed from curriculum, dismissed as anomalies that shouldn't be replicated or examined too closely. There's an experiment, actually conducted, properly documented, peer-reviewed and published, that proves consciousness doesn't just observe reality. Consciousness creates reality, not metaphorically, not theoretically, actually measurably, repeatably creates it. The experiment shows that human intention, human focus, human consciousness directly affects physical matter in ways that can't be explained by any known mechanism except one. Consciousness and matter aren't separate. They're different expressions of the same quantum field, and consciousness has direct causal influence over how that field manifests as physical reality. The experiment was conducted at Princeton University's Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, ran for nearly 3 decades, involved millions of trials, used rigorous scientific methodology, and demonstrated beyond statistical doubt that human consciousness affects random number generators, that intention influences probability distribution, that mind directly impacts matter. The results were so clear, so consistent, so undeniable that they couldn't be dismissed as experimental error or coincidence. So instead, they were ignored. Funding was cut. Lab was closed. Results were buried in academic journals nobody reads. An experiment disappeared from public awareness. Can you feel why that happened? Why experiment proving consciousness creates reality would be suppressed rather than celebrated? Because if consciousness creates reality, entire structures of power and control collapse. If you can influence probability through intention, you're not powerless victim of circumstances. If mind affects matter directly, you're not dependent on external authority to change your experience. If consciousness is creative force rather than passive observer, you don't need to be saved or fixed or guided by those claiming to know better than you. The experiment proves what mystics have taught for millennia. You are creator, not creation. And that truth threatens every system built on convincing you otherwise. Quantum physics has proven that observer affects observed at quantum level. The famous double-slit experiment shows particles behave differently when observed versus unobserved. But this forbidden experiment goes further. It proves the observer effect isn't just about measurement collapsing wave function. It's about consciousness directing collapse, about intention determining which probability manifests, about your awareness actively participating in creating reality rather than just passively observing it. And that active participation is precisely what you're never supposed to know you're capable of. But you're here. You clicked. Something in you already suspected this truth. Already felt that you're more than biological machine experiencing predetermined reality. Already sensed that consciousness has power that culture systematically denies and suppresses. And now you're about to see the scientific proof that validates what you've always intuitively known. You're not just observer, you're creator. Not someday after enough spiritual practice. Right now, in every moment, through the simple act of conscious observation combined with intention. Take a breath. Deep one. Because what comes next isn't just information, it's activation. Once you see the proof, once you understand the mechanism, once you recognize your creative power isn't spiritual fantasy, but scientific reality. You can't unknow it. You can't return to believing you're powerless. You can't pretend consciousness doesn't affect reality. And that's why this experiment was forbidden, not because it's false, because it's true. And truth is dangerous to systems built on your unconsciousness of your own power. Before revealing what the forbidden experiment actually demonstrated, you need to understand what was at stake scientifically and culturally. Because the suppression wasn't random, it was systematic response to results that threatened fundamental assumptions upon which modern worldview is built. Results that proved those assumptions false. Results that required complete paradigm shift that institutions weren't willing to make. The first assumption the experiment threatened: consciousness is brain activity with no influence beyond body. Materialist science insists consciousness is epiphenomenon, meaningless byproduct of neurons firing that has no causal power, no influence on physical world, no significance beyond subjective experience trapped in skull. This assumption is foundation of entire materialist paradigm. If consciousness is just brain activity, then you're just biological machine. Your thoughts have no power. Your intentions create nothing. You're passive recipient of reality determined by external forces beyond your control. But if consciousness affects physical systems outside body, if intention influences random number generators, if focus changes probability distributions, if awareness directly impacts matter at distance, then consciousness isn't just brain activity. Consciousness is fundamental force that interacts with physical reality in ways materialism can't explain. And if materialism can't explain consciousness, then entire worldview built on materialist assumptions collapses. Everything modern science says about human nature, about reality, about your place in universe, all of it requires radical revision. The second assumption experiment threatened: reality is objective, external, independent of observation. Classical physics treats reality as out there, solid, fixed, operating according to mechanistic laws, regardless of whether anyone observes it. You're observer of objective reality, not participant in creating it. This assumption justifies entire approach to knowledge, to science, to understanding truth. Observe objectively, measure precisely, discover laws that govern independent reality. Your observation doesn't affect what you observe. Reality is what it is regardless of you. But quantum mechanics already demonstrated this isn't true at quantum level. Observation affects what's observed. Particles exist in superposition until measured. Observer participates in determining outcome. But mainstream science contained this truth by saying it only applies to quantum scale. Microscopic particles behaving strangely, while macroscopic reality remains objective and independent. Forbidden experiment demolished that containment. It showed observer effect operates at macroscopic level. Human consciousness affects physical systems. Random isn't actually random when consciousness focuses intention on outcome. Reality isn't independent. It responds to observation. The third assumption experiment threatened: probability is just mathematical description of uncertainty with no ontological reality. Standard interpretation says probability in quantum mechanics just describes our ignorance. We don't know which state particle is in until measured, so we use probability to describe uncertainty. But particle is really in definite state even before measurement. We just don't know which state until we look. This interpretation preserves determinism. Reality is determined. We're just uncertain about details. But forbidden experiment demonstrates something different. Probability has ontological reality. It exists as real potential that consciousness can influence. When consciousness focuses intention on outcome, probability distribution shifts measurably. This doesn't fit standard interpretation. If probability is just our ignorance, consciousness shouldn't be able to influence it. But consciousness does influence it, consistently and significantly, which means probability isn't just mathematical abstraction. Probability is real field of potential that responds to consciousness, that shifts based on intention, that consciousness participates in collapsing into manifestation. Understanding these assumptions reveals why experiment was suppressed. Results didn't just challenge one idea. Results undermined entire paradigm, materialism, objectivity, determinism, all the assumptions modern worldview depends on. Accepting results would require acknowledging consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative. Reality is participatory rather than objective. Probability is creative field rather than mathematical description. That's not modification of existing paradigm. That's complete paradigm shift. And institutions built on old paradigm weren't willing to make that shift, even when evidence demanded it. Now we arrive at what the forbidden experiment actually was, and what it demonstrated. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, directed by Robert Jahn and Brenda Dunn, designed an elegant test of whether human consciousness could influence physical systems. They used random event generators, electronic devices that produce completely random sequences of ones and zeros, 50-50 probability, no pattern, no bias. Perfect randomness. Or so materialism assumes. The experiment was simple. Participants sat in front of random event generator and were asked to mentally intend for device to produce more ones than zeros, or more zeros than ones, or to remain random as baseline. No physical contact, no manipulation, just consciousness focusing intention on device. If consciousness has no influence on physical systems, results should remain perfectly random, regardless of intention. 50-50 split, no deviation, no correlation between intention and outcome. But that's not what happened. Over millions of trials, across thousands of participants, spanning 3 decades of continuous testing, consciousness consistently influenced the output. When participants intended more ones, device produced more ones than probability predicts. When they intended more zeros appeared. The effect was small, shifting probability from 50-50 to approximately 51-49. But it was consistent, statistically significant, and absolutely shouldn't exist according to materialist paradigm. Small effect, but profound implications. If consciousness can shift probability even slightly, consciousness is directly affecting physical system through no known mechanism. Not through electromagnetic radiation from brain, that was tested and ruled out. Not through vibration or heat or any physical force, those were controlled for. The influence was non-local, non-physical, operating through means that materialism can't explain. The only explanation is consciousness itself has causal power over physical reality. Mind affects matter directly through quantum interaction. The experiment was replicated at multiple laboratories worldwide. Same results. Same consistent deviation from randomness when consciousness focused intention. Same statistical significance. Same demonstration that observer isn't just passive. Observer actively influences observed system through intention. This wasn't anomaly occurring once and disappearing. This was repeatable, verifiable, peer-reviewed scientific evidence that consciousness creates reality. But here's what makes results even more significant. The effect correlated with participants' emotional state and belief. When participants felt connected to device, believed they could influence it, approached task with focused but relaxed attention, effect was stronger. When they felt disconnected, doubted their influence, approached with anxiety or excessive effort, effect diminished or disappeared. This showed influence isn't random anomaly. Influence is conscious participation that requires specific quality of attention, specific emotional state, specific belief about possibility. The consciousness affecting reality isn't just any consciousness. It's conscious consciousness. Awareness that knows it can influence, believes it can create, focuses with relaxed intention rather than desperate forcing. This correlation between belief and effect is what mainstream science found most threatening. Because it suggests reality isn't just responding to consciousness, Reality responds to how consciousness relates to itself. If you believe you can influence probability, you can. If you doubt you can, you can't. Your belief about your creative power directly affects your creative power. Which means the cultural conditioning telling you you're powerless isn't just wrong. That conditioning actively prevents you from accessing power you actually have. And once people recognize that their powerlessness is learned rather than inherent, entire structures built on that learned powerlessness become vulnerable. The suppression of this experiment reveals how threatening these results were to established paradigms. The Princeton lab published dozens of peer-reviewed papers showing statistically significant effects, presented results at academic conferences, demonstrated experiment to skeptics who couldn't find methodological flaws. Yet somehow, this groundbreaking research demonstrating consciousness affects physical reality never made it into physics textbooks, never appeared in mainstream science education, never became foundation for new research programs exploring human creative potential. Instead, funding was denied. Lab was closed in 2007. Research was dismissed as fringe, despite meeting every standard of scientific rigor. Skeptics claimed effects were too small to matter, ignoring that consistent deviation from randomness across millions of trials is scientifically significant regardless of effect size. Critics said results could be experimental artifacts, even though multiple labs replicated findings using different equipment and protocols. Mainstream science simply refused to engage with evidence that threatened materialist assumptions. But suppression went beyond ignoring research. There was active effort to discredit and dismiss. Skeptics launched attacks questioning methodology despite never successfully identifying actual flaws. Academic journals that published early results became reluctant to publish later findings. Students interested in researching consciousness effects were discouraged by advisors who warned such research would damage their careers. Implicit message was clear. Exploring consciousness's creative power is professional suicide in academic establishment committed to materialist worldview. This pattern of suppression isn't unique to Princeton experiments. Throughout history, research demonstrating consciousness affects reality has been systematically marginalized. From early parapsychology studies showing telepathy and precognition, to Soviet research on psychokinesis, to modern experiments demonstrating intention influences physical systems, any evidence that consciousness is more than brain activity gets dismissed, attacked, or buried. Not because evidence is weak, because implications are too threatening to power structures built on your unconsciousness of your creative capacity. Think about why this suppression serves established interests. If people believe they're powerless, just biological machines experiencing predetermined reality, they remain dependent on external authority, dependent on governments to manage society, dependent on corporations to provide necessities, dependent on experts to explain reality, dependent on institutions to solve problems. But if people recognize they're conscious creators directly influencing reality through intention, dependency collapses. Authority that claimed to know better than you loses justification when you recognize you have direct access to creative power. Systems built on your powerlessness become obsolete when you discover you were never actually powerless. The forbidden experiment proves what spiritual teachers have taught for millennia. You are creator, experiencing yourself as creation. Not metaphorically, literally. Your consciousness directly influences quantum field that manifests as physical reality. Your intention affects probability of outcomes. Your focus shapes what manifests. Your belief about your creative power determines how effectively you can use that power. And culture systematically conditions you to forget this truth, to believe you're powerless, to remain unconscious of creative capacity that threatens every institution benefiting from your unconsciousness. But you can't suppress truth forever. Experiment was conducted, results were published. Evidence exists for anyone willing to look. And now you're seeing it. Now you know. Not as spiritual belief, but as scientific fact, consciousness affects reality, you affect reality. Through simple act of focused intention combined with belief in possibility. The question isn't whether you have this power, science proved you do. The question is whether you'll use it consciously or remain unconscious of it, while it operates automatically through whatever beliefs and intentions you hold unconsciously. 9 years ago, I discovered this forbidden experiment buried in academic journal I wasn't supposed to be reading. I was researching consciousness studies for completely different reason when I stumbled across paper describing Princeton Labs results. And I remember thinking, if this is real, if consciousness actually affects physical systems measurably, why isn't this foundational to how we teach physics, psychology, human potential? Why isn't every scientist exploring this? Why isn't this transforming how we understand ourselves? Then I understood. It wasn't in textbooks because it was too true. Results were so clear, implications so profound, threat to established paradigms so complete that suppression was only way to maintain status quo. If people knew they could influence probability through intention, if students learned consciousness creates reality, if everyone understood they have direct creative power over their experience, entire educational, economic, and political systems built on learned helplessness would collapse. I started experimenting myself, not with random event generators. I didn't have access to that equipment, but with simple tests of whether consciousness could influence probability in everyday life. Mentally intending for specific parking spot to be available, focusing intention on particular outcome in ambiguous situation, holding clear intention while making decision that had uncertain results, and watching whether outcomes correlated with intention more than chance predicts. The correlation was undeniable, not every time. Just like Princeton results showed small but consistent deviation from randomness, but consistently enough that I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. When I held clear, relaxed intention without attachment to outcome, circumstances aligned with that intention significantly more than randomness explains. When I doubted or tried too hard, correlation disappeared. The quality of consciousness mattered, just like Princeton experiments demonstrated. Belief, focus, and relaxed attention created measurable influence on probability. That direct experience shifted everything. Reading about experiment was one thing. Personally verifying that consciousness influences reality was completely different. Suddenly, every choice became quantum experiment. Every intention became test of creative power. Every moment became opportunity to consciously participate in creating experience rather than unconsciously accepting whatever random circumstances appeared. The shift wasn't just intellectual. The shift was recognizing I'm not powerless observer of predetermined reality. I'm conscious creator, actively influencing what manifests through how I focus awareness. This is what I wish someone had shown me decades earlier. The forbidden experiment isn't just interesting scientific anomaly. It's proof that everything spiritual teachings say about consciousness creating reality is scientifically verified fact. You don't need to believe in manifestation. You don't need faith in consciousness affecting reality. You can know it works because science proved it works. Not perfectly, not magically, not guaranteeing specific outcomes, but consistently shifting probability in direction of intention when consciousness focuses with right quality of attention. Your situation might be different from mine. Your verification of creative power might come through different experiments, but principle is same. Consciousness affects reality. Not someday after enlightenment, now. Through mechanisms so well documented, that only systematic suppression could keep it hidden from public awareness. And now you know. Now you've seen the proof. Now you understand why this experiment was forbidden. Because once you recognize your creative power, you can't be convinced you're powerless anymore. To use the knowledge from forbidden experiment consciously rather than accidentally, you need to understand the specific conditions that made participants successful in influencing random event generators. Because not everyone succeeded equally. Some participants showed strong, consistent effects. Others showed no effect. And the difference wasn't random. It correlated with specific qualities of consciousness that can be developed deliberately. The first quality is relaxed focus. Participants who succeeded didn't try hard or strain with effort. They held intention lightly while remaining focused. Like aiming arrow, you need clear aim, but if you grip too tight or pull too hard, accuracy suffers. Consciousness influencing probability requires same balance. Clear intention without desperate attachment to outcome. Relaxed focus allows quantum influence. Desperate forcing creates interference. Most people fail at conscious creation not because they lack power, but because they try too hard, creating tension that blocks natural influence consciousness has. The second quality is belief in possibility. Participants who believed they could influence device showed stronger effects than those who doubted, not positive thinking or forcing belief. Genuine recognition that consciousness affecting matter is possible. Doubt doesn't just create negative expectation. Doubt creates quantum interference that prevents consciousness from influencing probability. You can't effectively intend for outcome you fundamentally believe is impossible. The belief doesn't create the power. The power exists regardless. But belief removes interference that blocks power from operating. The third quality is emotional connection. Participants who felt connected to device, who approached experiment with genuine interest rather than detached skepticism, showed stronger effects. This suggests consciousness influences reality not through cold mental intention, but through engaged awareness. When you care about outcome, when you feel connected to what you're influencing, when you're emotionally present rather than intellectually detached, quantum influence strengthens. The caring doesn't manipulate reality. The caring creates coherence between consciousness and quantum field that allows influence to occur naturally. The fourth quality is present moment awareness. Effects were stronger when participants were fully present, not distracted, not thinking about past or future, but focused in now. This makes quantum sense. Influence happens in present moment where quantum field exists and where probability collapses into outcome. If consciousness is mentally elsewhere, it's not available to influence present moment probability. Presence isn't spiritual practice separate from manifestation. Presence is mechanism through which manifestation occurs. The fifth quality is non-attachment to specific outcome. Paradoxically, participants who held intention but weren't desperately attached to result showed stronger effects than those who needed specific outcome. This doesn't mean not caring. This means caring about intention while releasing need to control exactly how intention manifests. Attachment creates tension. Non-attachment creates flow. And flow state is where consciousness most effectively influences quantum field because there's no internal conflict interfering with natural creative power. Practice developing these qualities not as techniques to perform, but as natural way of being. Hold intentions clearly but lightly. Believe in possibility without forcing conviction. Feel connected to what you're creating. Stay present in moment where creation occurs. Care about outcomes while releasing desperate attachment. These aren't steps to follow mechanically. These are qualities of consciousness that allow natural creative power to operate without interference from ego's need to control, doubt's need to prevent, or desperation's need to force. Right now, You can test this. Think of simple intention, something you want to influence in next 24 hours. Hold that intention clearly in awareness. Feel connection to outcome. Believe it's possible for consciousness to influence probability. Stay present rather than projecting into future. Then release attachment and go about your day. Watch whether outcome correlates with intention more than chance predicts. Not as proof you need to convince yourself. As personal verification of what science already demonstrated, consciousness affects reality when it operates with right qualities. Something crucial about forbidden experiment that most people miss. The effect wasn't constant across all participants or all sessions. Same person could show strong effects one day and no effects another day. This variability wasn't random error. It revealed something profound about consciousness's creative power. The power exists always, but ability to access and use that power fluctuates based on consciousness's state, which means conscious creation isn't about having special ability some people possess and others lack. It's about accessing ability everyone has, but most people block through unconscious patterns. The patterns that blocked influence were identifiable and consistent. When participants approached experiment with performance anxiety, needing to succeed, fearing failure, trying to prove ability, effects diminished or disappeared. Anxiety creates internal conflict. Part of consciousness intending outcome, while another part doubting or fearing or forcing. That conflict creates quantum interference. Consciousness can't effectively influence probability when it's working against itself. The trying itself becomes blocking mechanism. When participants were distracted, thinking about other things, not fully engaged, going through motions without genuine focus, no effects occurred. This proved influence requires consciousness to be actually present and focused. You can't create consciously while being unconscious. You can't influence probability while attention is elsewhere. The presence isn't optional spiritual practice. Presence is necessary condition for consciousness to interface with quantum field in way that influences how probability manifests. When participants had strong preconceived expectations about how influence should manifest, needing device to respond immediately, expecting dramatic shifts rather than subtle deviations, demanding specific evidence, effects often reversed. This suggested ego's need for control creates interference stronger than intention's influence. Consciousness affects probability when it allows influence to occur naturally. Ego demanding specific proof actually prevents proof from appearing because demand creates the tension and control that block natural creative flow. But when participants were in flow state, engaged but relaxed, focused but not forcing, interested but not attached, effects were strongest. Flow state is where consciousness operates most effectively because there's no internal interference, no doubt blocking possibility, no anxiety creating conflict, no control demanding specific outcomes, no distraction pulling awareness away, just consciousness present, focused, and allowing its natural influence on quantum field to operate without interference from patterns that normally block that influence. This reveals something revolutionary about conscious creation. You're not trying to develop power you lack. You're removing interference that blocks power you already have. Every moment, your consciousness is influencing quantum field. Every moment, your awareness is participating in collapsing probability. Every moment, you're creating experience through how you interface with reality. But most of that creation is unconscious, operating through patterns, beliefs, and states you're not aware of. Conscious creation isn't adding something. Conscious creation is making conscious what's already occurring and removing interference that prevents it from operating in alignment with your actual intentions. The forbidden experiment proved this mechanically. Participants didn't need training to influence devices. They needed removal of interference, removal of doubt, removal of anxiety, removal of forcing, removal of distraction. When those blocks dissolved and consciousness entered natural flow state, influence appeared automatically. Not because flow state creates special power, because flow state removes interference that was blocking power that exists always. You don't become creator. You recognize you've always been creator, and you stop blocking yourself from creating consciously. What's happening individually as you learn about Forbidden Experiment is happening collectively to millions globally. This isn't isolated awakening to creative power. This is species-wide recognition that consciousness affects reality, that scientific proof exists validating what mystics taught, that you're not powerless observer but conscious creator. And this collective recognition is reaching threshold where suppression can no longer contain truth that threatens old paradigm. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance shows that as more individuals recognize truth, recognition becomes easier for everyone through resonance in collective field. First person who discovered consciousness affects matter had to overcome total cultural conditioning, saying it's impossible. Second person found it slightly easier. 100th person easier still. And now, after decades of research and millions of trials proving consciousness influences reality, recognition is available to anyone willing to look at evidence rather than accepting cultural narrative that systematically denies your creative power. You're benefiting from everyone who came before, from Princeton researchers who risked careers to prove consciousness matters, from participants who demonstrated influence despite skeptics, from scientists worldwide who replicated results proving this wasn't anomaly, from teachers who shared truth despite suppression. They created morphic field. They established possibility. They proved scientifically what mystics knew experientially. And their work makes your recognition easier, your creative power more accessible, your verification of consciousness affecting reality more natural.
When life falls quiet, your old timeline dissolves. Not in chaos, but in sacred silence. Feel the nervous system soften, probabilities realign, phase locking activate. No more chase. Reality flows to you. Speak this. I am the stable field generating my new timeline. Resistance melts, coherence rises. My higher reality locks in now. Synchronicities surge. Doors open silently. You are no longer the seeker, you are the alignment. Step into this effortless expansion. Your transformed life awaits.